With Star Ocean 6 right around the corner, there's a good chance many are hearing about the series for the first time. As such, the question these people might be asking is, what is a Star Ocean? And so I thought it might be helpful to make a video briefly going over the series as an introduction. This will be less of a where to start guide and more of a why should I care piece. First off, the basics. What is Star Ocean? Star Ocean is an action RPG series that dates all the way back to the SNES era, though technically it'd be the Super Famicom era, as the first game wouldn't make it out of Japan until it was remade for the PS1. Created by a team of ex-Tales devs, specifically those behind that series' first title, Tales of Fantasia on the Super Famicom, Star Ocean is a series that blends space-age sci-fi with swords and sorcery fantasy to create a galaxy-spanning saga unique among its peers. Each entry in the series is relatively self-contained, both in cast and time period, and can be experienced as such. However, taken together, they weave a tapestry of roughly 8 centuries of spacefaring history, and more besides, where humanity takes its place on the galactic stage, and in doing so learns they're not alone. If this is starting to sound familiar, let me go ahead and say it. Star Ocean is basically JRPG Star Trek. Take it from me, someone who's never watched the show. Right down to no one ever following the Prime Directive, or UP3, as its Star Ocean equivalent is called. There are plenty of themes exploring the ethical responsibilities space-age civilizations have, not only towards each other, but towards those civilizations who've yet to leave their homeworlds. And while you're at it, you get to take on megalomaniacal anime villains with sword and spell. Best of both worlds, I'd say. So then, we've set the scene and got the idea, but what of the actual game? How do these games actually play? Well, the answer to that varies a fair bit depending on the entry. But broadly speaking, you'll be traversing both town and field on your adventures, getting into encounters with enemies along the way. Combat takes place in real time in the 3D space as you use a combination of normal and special attacks to combo your opponents, along with various defensive options to hopefully not get comboed yourself. The series is often compared to the Tales of series in this regard, and understandably so. Not only was it started by ex-Tales devs, but it's likely still the closest counterpart it has in gaming, at least combat-wise. Though I would say this mentality can cause some issues if you approach one as you would the other. Tales combat is typically fast and frenetic, very much channeling fighting games, and it's focused on combos and juggles while building meter for extra powerful attacks. Star Ocean's combos, on the other hand, often play to a slower, more deliberate tempo, where the focus is instead on chaining together the right responses to the enemy's actions to avoid having the advantage turned back around on you. Put another way, Tales tends to be more about maintaining advantage, while Star Ocean is more of a push-pull. One of the areas that most sets Star Ocean apart from other RPGs would be its crafting and various subsystems. Each game is, of course, still an RPG, and can be played as such. Just practice and grind, and eventually you and your character will become strong enough to handle most anything thrown your way. At least on normal difficulty. However, there's an almost entirely separate game you could play underneath the hood, where instead of worrying about your character's level, you can instead utilize technology to give them an edge. In each game, there's a number of subsystems that allow you to create various items. Anything from consumables to gear to skills can be made through the various item creation methods. But interestingly, not only are these systems shockingly deep, despite being ostensibly optional, but clever use of them can just about break the game in half. Fittingly enough, you can utilize your knowledge of technology and science to give yourself a boost in power so massive it can trivialize character stats entirely. That's some ludonarrative harmony. Thankfully, though, this is more or less completely optional for normal, and in fact can make the whole thing a cakewalk. Higher difficulties, however, are balanced around this, so you'd better be familiar if you're attempting those. The cool thing, though, besides its narrative cohesion, is that this design basically negates the typical tedium of grinding that comes with the RPG genre. As if you found yourself struggling, sure, you could spend a few hours leveling up, or you could play around with the item creation for half an hour and gain far more power as a result. And not only linear power, but you can tailor your build to specific fights and scenarios this way. But, of course, only if you're clever. You won't get far just mindlessly mashing stuff together. But, on the other hand, you don't have to mindlessly waste your time in the game to meet arbitrary stat requirements. Your power scales to your understanding of the systems, not to the amount of your day you're willing to burn. Narratively, Star Ocean is a series depicting the events of space-age civilizations meeting, and sometimes clashing, with each other, as well as trying, and failing terribly, to interact responsibly with underdeveloped civilizations. Oftentimes this starts with the main character being stranded on one of these underdeveloped planets, where they must survive both its wilderness and its civilization until they can be found and rescued, all the while trying to balance their responsibility to not influence the direction of said civilization's growth against their need to secure their own survival. This often results in them having to choose between their moral compass and their duty towards non-interference, bringing up difficult choices where there's often no clear correct answer. If your modern moralities clash with those of a more primitive society, do you have the right to intervene? If you have the technology to save lives, can you justify introducing it to a planet that may not be ready to handle it? Can you take responsibility for the consequences of your actions on a societal scale, when your choices have ripples that will be felt not just years, but decades or centuries into the future? These questions mount and force the characters to grapple with them, all the while sinister forces move in the background to raise the scope of the conflict beyond imagination. The world building in Star Ocean is another aspect that sets it apart. It is, and I am not normally one to use superlatives, honestly one of the best in the entire medium. The games have an insane attention to detail in this regard, especially once the glossary is introduced with 3. Beyond just flavor text from the NPCs, there's an actual in-game encyclopedia that defines and describes people, places, terms, and concepts. Someone mentions what planet they're from, the odds are that's a glossary entry. You can pull that up and read about the planet's environment and peoples. Want to know how a warp drive works? You actually can. Pull it up in the menu and you'll see the real-world scientific theories it's based on, sprinkled in with a fictional history of how it came to be reality. Want to know how even magic works? That's in there too. They even scientifically document the methodology of magic. That's the kind of world building we're working with here. If you're a fan of excellent world building in fiction, I cannot recommend this series highly enough. So, in summary, Star Ocean is a lot. But if I were to give a brief recap of the main points, they'd be an action RPG series set in and around space exploration in a not quite empty galaxy, and the questions and challenges that presents, with a healthy dose of both sci-fi and fantasy, unique progression systems and its item creation, as well as an arguably unparalleled level of world building. And if any of that sounds interesting to you, I highly recommend you check it out.